This presentation continues the study of Imperial Japan. Remember that this presentation is only a visual representation of the most important information, and there are much more detailed notes and readings on the website. This presentation will focus on Japanese expansion in Asia in between 1931 and 1941, including their fascination with nationalism and militarism, their problems at home and overseas, and partially why they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. Nationalism and militarism continued to grow in Japan, with a little bit of help from events in neighboring China. At the time, China was in the middle of a civil war, and a rebel Japanese military faction, the Kwantung Army, disobeyed government orders in China, eventually assassinating a Chinese leader. The Japanese government did nothing, and the military believed it was above the orders of the government. Meanwhile, back in Japan, things were not going well with the economy. The worldwide Great Depression had finally hit America, and Japan was unable to sell their goods around the world, and unemployment rose. Japan started to see Manchuria as a possible place to get the cheap resources they needed. In a truly dastardly deed, the Kwantung Army set up the Chinese in an attack on a Japanese railroad line in Manchuria. The Kwantung Army once again did as it pleased, ignoring the Japanese government. This action led to an international scolding of Japan, but not much else, and Japan used it as an excuse to drop out of the League of Nations. With the economy still in the dumps of the Great Depression, military supporters seized control of the Japanese government, but oddly enough, even through World War II, this was always done through elected representatives. The military groups were broken into two, the Kodaha and the Toseiha. The main difference was that the Kodaha wanted spiritual and cultural training of the military, while the Toseiha wanted a modern and dominant military to conquer China. In 1937, a Toseiha general, Hideki Tojo, gained control of the government and expanded Japan's attacks in China. Does this remind you of anything from medieval Japan? Shogun, maybe? In 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge located near the Chinese capital of Beijing, fighting broke out between the Chinese and Japanese forces stationed there. The Japanese unleashed their air force, and within 4 weeks, the air raids had given Japan control of huge parts of China. This was the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In the city of Nanking, or Nanjing, where many Western missionaries and journalists lived, the Japanese did some very terrible things. Some historians believe that what happened here was created by Western reports to damage the reputation of the Japanese. Others believe that the Japanese soldiers were horrible and committed terrible war crimes. If you want to know more, do a little research on this event. One of the results of the Sino-Japanese War was that China did not give up, and Japan was forced to keep continually fighting a war that it was not prepared for. Second, it forced Japan into conflict with European nations that had interests in China and elsewhere throughout Asia, so Japan was making European enemies. And finally, America did not like Japanese aggression, or the reputation for brutality that Japan was developing, so America seriously cut trade with Japan, especially war-making materials like oil and steel. Next, in 1940, it led to Japan joining the most evil Triforce alliance in the history of histories, the Tripartite Pact, with Germany and Italy, an alliance that gave control of Europe to the Nazis and fascists, and Asia to the Japanese. And eventually, it would lead to Pearl Harbor. There are 3 historical viewpoints on why the Japanese did this. The orthodox viewpoint, or the viewpoint at the time of the event, from an American perspective, was that Japan did it purely as an act of war. The revisionist viewpoint, or the viewpoint from a good number of years after the event, was that American President Roosevelt knew the Japanese were going to attack America, held back vital information from military commanders, and let the attack happen so America could officially get into World War II. The post-revisionist viewpoint, many years later, argues that aspects of both orthodox and revisionist arguments are probably true. Either way, the end result was thousands of American deaths and American entry into World War II. This presentation covered Japanese expansion and how the ideologies of nationalism and militarism had an impact on Japanese actions both at home and in other countries, especially China. It talked about Japanese actions that drew them into war in neighboring China, and how who was in control of the Japanese government had a lot to do with these actions. Finally, it covered the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and how Japanese actions helped lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Remember, this presentation is just the main points, and much more extracting details are covered in the notes and readings on the website.